changes that the whole county has the possibility to go out and vote, and some of them,
But the whole county doesn't vote for the
of course, but when they're making a decision in May to come vote, it's like I'm going to vote in this municipal race or nothing. But I also should go and vote in this constitutional amendment election because actually the turnout there, if you compared the November odd year turnout in Harris County for the folks that don't have anything but those constitutional amendments on their ballot, to the ones in Houston, or there are other cities that have odd year, November odd year elections in Harris County.
Right.
So,
But what does that, so I agree with that, right? So city voters are going to vote for city elections, right? And yeah, I had 9 people on my ballot, and we had 27 on the mayoral. Those people are going to vote. But the thing that I'm looking at right now is you mentioned consolidated elections. And everyone that has called me has said we need less elections. And I agree. No one would disagree that we need less elections. But by us moving this unilaterally, would we not just the ISDs that stay, that are in our boundaries, that stay in Maine, will we be cannibalizing their voter base? Because folks, if they're coming out for us, they're just going to come out for the ISDs.
I mean, I don't have a map of your boundaries, so I don't know what share of those ISCs that are not in the city, pieces of them. So I would say it's a broader argument, you have to look at that, but I mean, it's a question of whether you want to sacrifice potentially broadening your electorate and gaining more representation among the folks who are voting for you, to sort of address the concerns that you have for the ISPs that that's going to potentially be to folks voting. And I think if they have the chance to move, you're right, consolidating requires everybody shifting, and then maybe you don't have this May election. I mean, we're going to vote in the primary, then they're going to come to May, then they're going to have a runoff in June. There's a lot of voting going on in the spring, so if we could just get rid of one of those and have it in November, there's not a lot of things on the November odd-year ballot. I mean, we had 20 constitutional amendments. Those are a lot, but when you get down, there aren't a lot of other things. So it's not like the Austin problem where they might have 90 races on the November even, and then people get tired by the time they come to the municipal. That's not happening in November odd year. So I think in a way, it's an opportunity to highlight yourselves without getting lost in a super long ballot, but also saving folks the trouble of having to keep going down.
I appreciate you coming down. The last comment that I'll make is on the cost, right? And we just discussed it. The cost for the May 2025 election that I got the invoice from, and it was mentioned on there, was $470K. And our runoff was $1.1 million. So runoff we're going to have to bear anyways if we have a mayoral election because we're the only ones on the ballot. But our portion of the May election is only $470,000. So that the savings number, to Eric's point, is very ambiguous. And we actually, at least I had the wrong interpretation of how we split the dollars. So we actually thought we were split based on the number of items that are on the ballot, but it has nothing to do with that. We split the cost based on the number of registered voters. And in November, for an odd year, because we have to open every single location, we have to split the cost for every single location site in Bear County. So it wouldn't even just be in the city boundaries that our runoff was. This year, you have to split the cost for every single location site in the county. And so whether we have saved enough money, whether we saved that $800 or $1 million is very questionable in my opinion. But the most important thing is we are representing our tax base. And even if we're saving money for the city, which I understand our responsibility is to the city, but at the same time, our taxpayers are going to have to increase their costs for their school district elections. So at the end of the day, it's like shifting the expense from one person to the other. And I have looked at the financials of, I think there's 3 districts at least that adopted deficit-based budget for the last several years in our area, and they don't have, they are, I think, in a much more vulnerable financial position than we are as a city. And so all that to be said, if we could get everything together and move from May to November, I would support it, because then I think we will all benefit. So we're going to try hosting a meeting early next week with all of the districts that are on the ballot in May. It also have to be, some of the cities are also going to be affected because I.e. Buckotas Heights, they are governed by the state. So the state tells them they have to have elections.
In case it addresses anyone else's questions, Julia, can I ask, have you done an assessment of, because you don't have to stay in May. In fact, the legislation allows you even beyond the end of the year to consider moving your elections to join in November if you'd like to do that. Have you all done an assessment of the cost savings to the handful of ISDs? I know you represent some ISDs that vote in November, right? We have some that vote in May. Have you all done an assessment of the cost savings to those ISDs if they were moving to November?
So, great question. We did investigate how the city and then also other smaller municipalities are currently paying for the election. So when we look at how we are sharing the cost in the May election, because we have a lot of our municipalities, because over the last few years we've had the Alamo Community College as a bond, along with COSA, we actually, again, depending on how many ISDs move over, if COSA moves over with us, if any of the other municipalities move over with us, but if, say, just the ISDs moved along with COSA, we don't have analysis of what that savings would be because it does look like we would potentially be, it would cost slightly more. Now, that to be said, if we were looking at limiting the polling sites that would be available, because that's a choice of entities when they go into a particular election day, as I understand it, they could cut down the potential cost of going to an election where less entities were providing the cost of November. I know that's not probably a satisfactory answer, but it depends on all of those different entities and if they also decide to move along with an IC or along with COSA at the same time.
Okay. But again, there is nothing preventing your ISDs from moving to November as well. Okay.
So,
go ahead.
yes, we have there was a bill that was passed this last legislative session that if an ISD did want to move their elections, they could do it before 2030. However, because of Chapter 11 in the Education Code, for our districts that don't share municipal bounds with other municipalities, they would have to move if COSA moves in particular way. So that would be the only time-sensitive thing that would potentially impact our decision-making ahead of 2030 if they did want to move or maybe didn't want to move and felt like they needed to because of some of the changes. Yeah.
Councilman Bell.
Thank you. And I just want to start off by saying thank you to the mayor for this, to our attention, and bringing this to the council for a conversation. I think it's always worth evaluating how we can increase turnout here as it gets to the elections, how we can make our community more representative of what we're representing. Make sure that as many as possible are engaged in the city elections at every level of the particular course here. It's important to me and always has been. When folks may not know me when full past, one of the first things I did in my political journey was knock on neighbors' doors, asking them to vote in the 2016 election. From there, I became a registration, a voter registrar. There, I became a field organizer for the Texas Network, doing this exact work. So trying to get folks out to vote. Talking to renters, talking to communities of color, talking to students, organizing them around at UT Austin and UTSA, here in San Antonio. Like, there was a lot of things that I've done. I had that this feels like a very good culmination point for this particular conversation about how do we get our folks to turn out? How do we get our folks to get engaged? How do we follow the legacy of Billy Blasio? How do we follow the legacy of folks who are still here with us, who are doing this work? How do we follow the legacy of our edge folks in District 6 who crossed Old Highway 90 in efforts to try to make things more equitable in our community, not only in education, but at large? That is at the root of this. I think that's where my heart is here, and yet I have a lot of concerns here. And I'm going to get to all that, but I also want to thank everyone who spoke today. I want to thank everyone who made their voices heard to my office, through emails, through phone calls, through our survey. We'll continue to have those things open and continue on this conversation through next week. And so I'm really want to hear from our residents more about what they're thinking on this particular issue. I don't think I can say anything better than Councilmember Core really engaging with that because it's something that her and I spoke about very frequently. It's something that we both care about, and I think it's, I don't know what the right word is for this, but I guess it's very lucky in a way. Today we had a good conversation. make sure that we're moving the needle on educational actions. And it's something that it's something I ran on. Frankly, it's something that I ran on, which is trying to find ways to shape our local schools. It's something that I'm grateful that the mayor trusted to appoint me to be chair of that committee, that she newly formed as well. So there is this renewed focus, right, on public education here within our city. And part of that responsibility for me has been to work as much as I can with the ISD's other educational partners in our communities. I really wish all the folks that will speak with, the superintendents that will speak with, the board members in my community, and folks who are here for us today, in regards to ISD, of course, thank you to Julia for all the work you do every single day. And so I get stuck this moment, and I'm going to say that out loud, as uncomfortable as may be to do so, in that I feel that this is a good thing to do. I feel it somewhere in me. I feel it's a good thing to do because it makes sense to make sure that our elections are consolidated. The voters I talked to for months on end said, okay, this is opinion. And we have to constantly remind them, that's our opinion, you know, we can do that. But to make it as easy as possible is what we should always try to do. It's something that I've tried to do my entire, most of my entire life in the show so far. So that's a big portion of it, right? And so but then I get stuck with this kind of, how do we make sure that we are moving as a body here with the groups that are behind to uplift us and hold and strengthen. And it comes with making sure that we're communicating as possible. And I wish one more time, I know it's not anyone, because it falls on, except for the law was written, to make this the way it is right now. I still would like to find ways to engage more on this, so we can move all together on this, and continue to build a relationship with our ISDs every step of the way, to ensure that as they're working on some of this work, educational opportunities committee in general, with educational achievement, that we're not doing so without everyone who does this work here today every step of the way with us. And I think that's the biggest thing that I've heard from educational leaders, and I won't say anyone who, but I've talked about. This is the first time the city has really engaged a bit in education, or education in general, but sometimes, even other places do this, is traditionally into, we do so with a case without engaging our folks, and then we do so, it becomes a bigger problem later on. And so I want to make sure that we're deliberate in our actions. I'll say that broadly there, because I think that's a big part for me in this particular moment. Another part I think that's important to me too, is the conversation around turnout representation. Again, incredibly important to me. And I think about moving selection. I struggle to find research, and even within the report that says today, right, of how the off-cycle elections in particular will make that any better. I understand we can increase the constitutional election turnout if we move our election there, because we're the drivers of that turnout. Every single time, whether contested or not, we still deserve higher than that election, unless there's a very special November ballot, local ballot positions on there, which I think also deserves its own credit and praise about local ballot positions, and the data, and the literature, which I actually am grateful. Also, that you have that within your own research in 2018, most recent report that you had a conversation, a comprehensive look at. It's not just ranking, it's also competitiveness, it's also algorithms, it's also listening. And so I get stuck with if we're trying to make sure that more working class voters are coming out to vote, which I believe is the thing. If we're trying to make sure that more communities of color come out to vote, which I believe is the thing, and it is mine, that even folks who have lower educational achievement are coming out to vote too. I don't think off your election do that. That doesn't mean I'm against this move, but I want to be clear on what we're talking about here. We know very clearly presidential and midterm elections bring out the most votes. And again, the state law is very strict on what we're doing here and doesn't allow us to talk about general elections. But I think we know that conversation a bit because it's worthwhile. It's worth thinking about how we actually increase this turnout. And I still don't feel that this one's going to do it. Maybe it's marginal. I appreciate that. I wasn't elected to work on margins, frankly. And I don't think that still fits with this concept that we're in, so I'm trying to figure that out for myself. I'm being honest about it because I think that's what I owe everyone here, and my voters in general, my residents in general. And folks who are doing this work, right? Are we doing something meaningful here or not? And I struggle to fully agree on whether we are or not. Do I think it's detrimental? No, I don't think it. I don't think it harms and makes the decision to get away. I think we can still work on educational work. I think we can still build the world we're trying to build. But I get
there is certainly not an association of voting with May. On top of the fact, in May, we have potentially more distractions, if you will. At least locally, we have this wonderful party called Fiesta. And so, despite that, to your point, there was just a 10,000 point difference between May and November. And so, it would make sense then, you tell me if I'm wrong here, it would make sense if you have the benefit of voting in groups, engagements, and people associated voting with November, and you had, frankly, not the competition with Fiesta. I think this is the point that you were making, in that you could actually see higher turnout as a result of those things, to include potentially surpassing, as you described, Houston. So while when you look at this by itself, it looks, oh, it's higher there. Well, that doesn't mean it could not, in fact, be higher in November, because people associate November with voting. And two, you've got groups like registrars and others who are actually talking about and helping people engage in the voting process in a way that they might not in May. If I have mischaracterized anything that you said, please correct me.
I think that's correct. I think it's worth noting that National Voter Registration Day is in September, and Constitution Day is in September, and those are big days on college campuses and in high schools to get folks registered, and it'd be great for them to be able, to vote and do more when they go out to vote. I think that the issue with young folks in high school is that in September for National Voter Registration Day, not very many of them are 18 yet, which is why we try to go into the spring to get them when they're mostly have turned 18 to get them registered. So those are different challenges. But I just want to add too that you're completely correct. We're talking about off-cycle elections. The reason that off-cycle elections were implemented during the Progressive era was to reduce voter turnout of immigrants, to get rid of the party machines that were viewed as corrupt. The legacy of the Progressive era was to reduce. The intention of off-cycle elections was to reduce voter participation among the working class, among immigrants, and that's exactly what we see. So you're right, we're moving from like really off-cycle to a little bit less off-cycle. But that's the option that you have,
It makes it a little bit better, essentially, to your point.
And I just want to add that no one's really mentioned that the constitutional amendment elections happening in November obviously affect all of us as residents of the state. So I think another argument would be that do we want our cities to be better represented in what the state's doing on those, where the turnout is often extremely low. And I think our voices in general as an electorate are not heard in those elections as they should be. I mean, some of the turnout is less than 5% in those constitutional amendment elections, which is ridiculous.
Councilwoman Castillo.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you to members of the public, Graciela, and my love for giving your public comment. And what I value about Graciela's public comment is every time she comes to the podium, I learn something new. So it's great to hear the connection to Southwest voters and that history and the relationship with voter engagement. No doubt, elections are the bedrock of our democracy, and this is a conversation that I don't take lightly, nor do I believe it should be one that we have an expiration date on. And I'm hopeful beyond this conversation we continue to talk about what voter engagement looks like and how we continue to educate the public to ensure that we have well-informed voters going to the polls, whether it's a May or November election. But when I received the memo from the mayor about the work that the city of Dallas had did and how they adopted this unanimously, I reached out to the Dallas City Council member to understand the context in which this was initiated and the work that was done. And what Adam shared with me is that there was a lot of good work put in terms that their city council took this to the voters of Dallas. So I have Jeff, if you don't mind, can you walk us through a bit of the history of the initiation of this bill and some of the work that the city of Dallas did present at the neighborhood association meeting, but I think there's value in going to the ballot box to express your position in terms of is this something that we're comfortable with moving forward or not. And while it did pass overwhelmingly in Dallas, I do think San Antonio residents deserve the same type of engagement, input, and opportunity to go to the ballot box. Now, in terms of the impact on municipal elections with our ISDs, I want to thank Dr. Ford for her leadership, ensuring that she works with the ISDs and coming with potentially mitigating impacts. This is the primary area of concern for my team as well. 4 out of 5 independent school districts in District 5 have their elections during May. And while I understand that this could potentially drive voter turnout, my concern is also to ensure that we're not passing the bill to our ISDs, which are already severely underfunded, and always, looking for more financial support to support our kids. And I don't feel comfortable making a move that's going to potentially remove money from out of the classroom because of the change that we made here at the city. So I want to be sure that the discussion that's taking place and equipped with all the information before I make a decision next week. But that is a priority, and I know it's a very short timeline. I don't know if Eric has heard any school district that's had the time to crunch numbers to see what that financial impact would potentially be for their school district.
No, ma'am, I haven't, but I have also only spoken as part of the follow-up primarily with Julia, because there are 15 or 16, 17 school districts that I'm not aware of that, but we can follow up on that.
Thank you for that. And I also want to thank Mr. Cracker being here, superintendent of Northside IMT, and I think Northside IMT rather. But to that point, right, there are school districts in District 5 like Northside that have several counties that intersect, right? So we're not just talking about the impact to Bear County. There's Bandera and Medina County that also intersect that school district that's in 5, and I want to ensure that we're being mindful when moving forward with any policy change that may impact our school districts. I just want to thank Julia for this one pager that shows that there will be costs associated with changing our elections from May to our ISDs, because I think that also goes to the point that I'm hearing from constituents, those that have expressed that they are supportive of changing, they believe that it's going to save the taxpayers' dollars. And as Councilmember Dr. Ford mentioned, at the end of the day, if you're a property owner and you look at your tax bill, the majority of that bill is for the ISD. So ultimately, San Antonio residents who own property will continue to have to pay for whatever changes we make regarding the local elections. So I just want to be sure that yes, it will likely, potentially, we don't have the exact number, can save the city of San Antonio money, but ultimately, the city of San Antonio residents will still continue to put the bill for elections. So I think it's important that that key point is emphasized. So another point, and I just want to thank Professor from Rice University for her presentation, because my team had also been looking at data, and similar to the point that Councilmember Dr. Ford raised, is when we look at Houston, right, which has had odd November elections for quite some time, their turnout in Harris County 5 was at 17%, which is similar to the city of San Antonio in 2025 runoff elections. So again, right, we know the intent is to engage more voters, but when we look at cities and counties like Harris County, Houston, there's not much of a shift in participation. I hear the concerns about voter fatigue, but for a district that has over 5 independent school districts, my residents are still going to have to continue to go out and vote in May. But I do believe at the core of this conversation is more voter apathy, right? When we talk to San Antonio residents and folks who may be registered but aren't participating, they have a voting trust with government because they feel that decisions are made for them and then explained to them later, rather than engaging, co-creating policy and moving together on a decision. And I think that's a responsibility that we all have, whether we're a bureaucrat or an elected official, to continue to rebuild that trust and engage community. And I think an example of that is Patrick, the District 5 constituent, who came to our office on a Saturday. I happened to be there, and Saturday was cleaning up the office, and he needed some assistance. And we sat there together, we called a whole list of folks that could potentially provide assistance. And that day, we weren't able to connect to the resource that we needed. But I'm grateful that Patrick's staff was able to follow up and get him connected to the appropriate resource. Come May, it's already too late to vote in municipal elections. And he said, Terry, I registered to vote. I want to vote for you. I've never participated before. And I was like, Patrick, election day it was passed, right? higher educated and white individuals that continue to participate. So I think it's going back to the older applicant part and how we re-engage community and rebuild that trust that's been eroded with San Antonio residents. And that being said, we take the transnational approach. It finds that the trend is an issue of voter turnout. It's not unique to San Antonio, Texas, or the United States. It's something that many countries are grappling with on how to rebuild that trust and increase voter participation. Those are my comments. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilman Spears.
Thank you, Mayor. I really am glad you put this on for discussion because I care about the very same things that we're all talking about. We want maximum turnout. We want the most cost savings. And my first question though is for Jeff. Can you tell me how many times this has gone up before the legislature to move an election?
I have a backup slide. I think it's 16. So I don't know the question about how many times it's gone to the legislature because there undoubtedly were bills filed that didn't pass. But the first year that this section went into state law that said essentially that political subdivision can move from May to November if they do it by a certain date was 1993. Over the past, this is what, 32 years, 17 legislative sessions, there have been 11 times there have been a change that passed the legislature to extend that deadline. Now, if you look at the 2015, the 84th legislature, that's the last time prior to this past session that it applied to all cities. The deadline was 2016 and it sat that way until 2025. But there were some other cities that went and got bracketed bills done and specifically applied to them to allow them to make the change. So the long and short of it, I hope I'm answering your question, is 17 legislative sessions, the deadline has been extended 11 times.
So it's, I would say, fairly commonly done across the state.
I think I'll let the data
Okay.
decide.
That's good. That's good.
Yes, that's the history.
Thanks, Jeff. I want to thank Professor Marshall for your study. Because it really did help bring some data for us to look at. And I found it so interesting to see that overwhelmingly Texans and Americans prefer a consolidated election currently, which requires it being an even year election. If you're with federal and state.
I mean, I don't think there's any place that has one election for everybody, like once every 2 years, all of the state, federal, local are on the ballot. So consolidated can be partially, right? There's some federal, there's some state, there's some local, or there's state and local together, or there's local and federal together.
But not just local.
I mean, in May it's just local.
Consolidated.
I mean, May is just local, right?
So your slide here, I don't know what slide number it is. It's consolidated, meaning more than one legislative body is on the ballot.
Or just government level.
Government
Yeah,
level.
federal, state.
Federal, state, yeah. Okay. So that brings me to kind of what I want to say is that if we're looking at maximum voter turnout, it's unequivocally moving to an even year. I understand that this legislation says only an odd year, but that doesn't prohibit us from going back to the legislature and asking for them to help with us getting this moved to an even year. And in that time frame, we're able to go out to our constituents and talk to them about what that would look like, get their feedback on adding 6 months to our term, and voted that. I want to remind everyone that would mean we would vote on an additional budget, and that's important to point out that we would vote on a budget and then leave office potentially. And I want to be able to communicate that to my constituents. I'd like to be able to see data on running November odd with November even years, and also May odd with November even years, and look at how this impacts other suburban cities and ISDs, the Alamo community colleges, the other taxing entities. I think ultimately we need a vote from our residents before we move any participation, and it's moving to an even year. We'll see that the numbers are just exponentially higher than an even year. It would eliminate potential voter confusion. I think an odd November election is just a May election with colder weather. And it may even, I don't know, it's not pretty warm in November, but to me that's the impact is in an even year. And there's a lot of data showing that we definitely can go, especially if this past one with Dallas was unanimous, we can definitely go back to them and say, hey, we're interested in doing our elections and we want the maximum turnout, we want the maximum cost savings, and an even year election accomplishes that. And I feel we've got to have a little time to talk to our more time to talk to our constituents and collect a lot of really solid data. I mean, we haven't even seen this. This would allow us a little time to see what happens in Dallas as well. So I really appreciate your study. This is a lot of data, but I would say we need to move on our legislative priorities and look at moving to an even year election cycle and talk to our constituents about how they feel about that. So thank you.
Councilor White.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't have a lot that hasn't already been said, so I'm just going to make it quick, but and really just highlight a few points. We got this memo from the mayor on November 25th, if I believe it was a Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and the suggestion is that we vote on December 18th. So less than a month here to discuss this with each other, with the citizens of San Antonio, and frankly, that just strikes me as wrong. As was highlighted earlier, right? Dallas, I guess, really did it the right way. They took it to the voters. I think it was Proposition D on the Dallas ballot in November of 2024. And the voters said we want to do this. And so consequently, their state legislators went to got this session earlier this year, and they moved the bill through without opposition, right? Like I said, you said it was a permissive bill, right?
I think if you look at the for and against in the committee hearing, there were a couple of folks signed up, and a couple in support. But as the mayor said, it was largely a
bipartisan bill and went through. And this is something that has happened now, I guess, 11 out of the last 17 legislative sessions. So, it appears to me that we're talking about our 2029 election. There's another legislative session in 2027. Why would we not take the next year or two to talk about this with the residents of San Antonio? Maybe we put it on a ballot here for our residents to weigh in, just like they got to do in Dallas. And then if this is something that the citizens of San Antonio support, just like the citizens of Dallas did, then it's something that we ask our legislative folks to do in 2025. And then we don't have this rushed process where we're being asked to look at something and do it in 4 weeks. And Councilwoman Castillo brought up voter trust. She was talking about apathy and how it's due to the lack of the citizens' trust in what goes on in city government. And I think doing something like this, moving the elections without even talking to the residents, just adds to that voter distrust. It's another instance where the citizens say, well, they're doing whatever they want. They're extending their term in office because they want to. They're getting to go through another budget session, right? Because they want to. We got no say. And so, I think this is an interesting discussion. as Councilwoman Alcarte Benito said, and I'm with her on this, you know, I don't know that this is a bad idea to move the elections to November. I really don't. I think we need to look at it further. I think we need to talk with the citizens of San Antonio and then decide. And we are not being held at gunpoint to make this decision a week from tomorrow. We can talk about it, we can decide in 2027, and if we make the change in 2027, our 2029 elections can still move forward in a new manner if that's what the citizens of San Antonio want. Thanks, Mayor.
Councilman Keo. My apologies, Councilwoman Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, everybody, for being here to speak on your work and to Professor from Rice and for being here and sharing that report with us. I'll preface this by saying we were all elected in May, and I believe we are probably the most diverse council in the history of the city, and I think that's a lot. That says a lot about this community and who elected us. I think voter engagement is embedded in who I am and what I grew up learning, and I'm that friend that everyone goes to about who do I vote for, where do I go, and so I believe in this fully. Participation is key in our democracy, and with that, I'm concerned that this is not necessarily a bad idea, but it's a rush idea. And it's an idea that deserves input from stakeholders who are the most affected. And those are our ISDs. I see Dr. Kraft here with Northside ISD and Dr. Carla Budon, Northside ISD board member. Thank you for all the work you do for our community and for our children at Northside every single day. I know you have a very busy schedule, a lot of other things you could be doing, but so I have some questions, and I don't know if Julia can answer this, but can you explain or help us explain how we could start to estimate the cost of this election? I know we don't have our elections administrator here, right? And I don't know if you've been in this, she's not here, or if we've been in discussion with her, but I imagine you might be the one to help me explain, where could we start to estimate the cost of these elections?
Sure. When this first came up, started engaging with all of our ISDs as to how much this cost. For each ISD, could we understand if they wanted to stay in May and there have municipalities that they could partner with in order to stay in May, what would be the differences in cost for the polling stations? Went through a lot of the city charters and talked to a lot of the other member municipalities to see who's on May versus November odd years. And so after actually going through that exercise and looking at a lot of the invoices, we're able to connect with the elections administrator who shared that, as Dr. Moore mentioned before, Councilman Moore mentioned, that we, as all entities, share the cost of all polling stations across Bear County. And so for May, we currently have 10 other municipalities besides COSA that share the cost of the May election. And so if, say, Northside, and I know Dr. Kraft, if I get anything wrong, you just throw something at me. But if, say, Northside wanted to stay in May, they would have to still share the cost of everyone left over, and then decide they wanted to give the same kind of voter access that we have previously allowed for during May odd years. If Northside wanted to allow that along with the other entities because it would be a group decision, then that cost could potentially increase 32%, that's an offset from COSA, or potentially even more depending on if we lose any other entities, right? Because still potentially open, and again, if we wanted to open all those polling stations. Now, if Northside and other entities wanted to say, okay, we can't afford that change, for Northside that is up to a difference of potentially several $100,000. That's, a couple teachers, that's a difficult budgetary decision to say the least. But let's say if Northside of their voter registration have less voters, and so they're responsible for less cost of that election, which would potentially put more cost on the larger groups that would come into that election. Again, if they're coming one at a time, it would be different, as it's been pointed out, if everybody goes together.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I guess I go back to, I know we've talked about this November 2025 election with the Spurs, but I think if it tells us anything, it's the amount of money that it takes to bring those folks out. And that's what it takes for anybody that's on a ballot. And so that increase in turnout, I think there are so many factors that we haven't even touched on. And I don't want that to be, I don't want that to just, to assume that November 25 is almost like an anomaly in a lot of ways. And that was a very well-funded machine that brought those out. And we know that's what you have to do to bring folks out. It's knocking on doors, it's sending mailers, it's texting them, it's a whole list of things that we have to do to bring folks out. And so I want to make sure that before we make this decision, what are our options, I guess, in general, right? If not now, what are other options? I don't know if Eric or Jeff or can answer that.
Thank you for your question, Councilwoman. I mean, obviously, I think there's been some exploration of this idea of the ISL just kind of articulated as I see it from this position. So I think there's an opportunity in the next legislative session to advocate for a change that maybe voters have considered, this council has considered, right? And that might open the window again. So there is a way forward that could happen before the 29 election cycle, which is the first time this would affect this body. So I think that's one path.
And I guess when we talk about, yes, I know my colleague to the right of me has mentioned and has had conversations, I think, with the Fiesta Commission. We can always move Fiesta. That is an option. And we might want to consider that. Excuse me? Oh, well, we should. I'm all for that. Let's do that. But I think we should have those conversations, right? We cannot move the holidays, November, December, cold weather, Christmas parties. We can't do any of that. The other concern I have too is moving to this November. I think we might lose a Saturday in that process. Does anyone have the calendar of a November election, like early vote, election day? We get in this May election, a Saturday and early vote, and then obviously Saturday election day. So do we lose a Saturday in moving to November?
I have not done that math, Councilwoman, so I can try and do it.
I have, I think we do. So that's
And early vote Saturday, you're saying, correct?
Well, election day is on Tuesday, right? It's on Tuesday, so we lose that election day. Do we get it in that early vote?
Okay.
That's a concern to me, because obviously working families depend on those weekends to vote, and so I want to make sure that we think about that as well. So ultimately, I think, I'm not saying this is a bad idea, but I do think it's rushed, and I think we have the responsibility to bring our stakeholders to the table. We're very lucky in this city to have the Bear County Education Coalition, which is the largest coalition of superintendents in the state, and they're housed here in San Antonio. We have Dr. Woods, former superintendent, who is now director of Texas Association of School Administrators here in San Antonio. We even have a government affairs director for Texas Association of School Boards here in San Antonio. We have these folks at our disposal, and we need to bring them in sooner than later to have these conversations, because I do not want this to fall on the students and teachers in the community that I represent. Thank you.
Councilman Rubio.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to thank everybody for being out here. Thank you, Manuel, for being here. What was the first election you ever worked in? Was that George Washington? What year?
phone banking, block blocking, and calling folks, and figuring out it was different and interesting how the election in the city was in May and not November at that time, back in 2009. Just seeing, of course, President Obama win that election, it was very optimistic time. So, was on the board of Texas for some time also. I was a school board member who stood in a November even year election. I don't even know if that's the best. I had one guy say, I'm just here to vote for Bethel, and that's it. I don't care who you are, I'm just here to vote for Bethel. So we did lose some votes, right, in that election also. But just to say, I think it's a very good conversation that's being had here by the folks that showed up today. I think everybody here, no matter what side of the they're on, wants people to show up and vote. It wants the best decision for everybody in our community. So I think everybody's coming from the best place of heart. I did happen to look at some information in District 4, right? And this is very personal to me because District 4 is traditionally the second lowest voter turnout district in the entire city of San Antonio. And so when we're talking about changing the election and we're trying to get more folks to the ballot, it's extremely personal to me as well. So, we have a very low turnout. I would say that we did the data, right? It peaked in May 2021 at 8,000 or 17% of my community. Of course, at that time, it was very controversial and we contested about being on the ballot. This past November, we actually saw the greatest turnout in District 4 at 19%, with 10,000 plus voters coming to vote. Mostly, I'm sure, on this first proposition. Now, I understand the cost was very different, right? My campaign was nowhere near $7 million as the campaign. I can guarantee you $7 million was not spent just in District 4. And again, we had a high turnout. And I think something, someone mentioned, right? People really come to the ballot for voter issues, propositions, and ideas. And that's where you see high turnout no matter what month the election's in. I do think, however, consolidation into November is where we should be. And I would strongly recommend the rest of the school districts that are not in November to consider why a state name at this point. Why not go to November? We have a list here of school districts that are, of course, in May, including our strategy with Dr. Kraft, that you seems like we're in half the city, right? Or should I be? And so I see, a couple of my districts in here, also Southwest. They have their own separate election issue, which I think is also needs to be fixed over there as well. And we have, of course, South San Jose, which is in November. So, can you tell me which other schools, Julia, are in November currently?
Yes, we have one district that is in November odd years. That covers some of Bear County, a little bit of San Antonio, that Cibolo. We have 4 that are in November even. So that is South San Antonio, East Central, Somerset, and Edgewood. And then we have one district that is in May, even that's Northeast ISD. We do have some outer edge districts that impact, like I said earlier, they're one of the entities that we would split costs with. So that's Comal. ISD is in, if I indicated on the sheet, Medina Valley is in May years, or May of odd years, or maybe odd Mays, I don't know. So that was a terrible joke. So it's odd years in May, and then also Comal. So just a consideration, again, in terms of dividing costs or the cost of joining or exiting the May election.
Sure, absolutely. I think that's something to consider, right? I'm always very sensitive as a former school member, right? What that does to the budgets. But I do think it's worth looking into. The vast majority of our elected offices are going to be in November, right? All the federal level, your state officials, your county officials, right? All that is in November. And that's what you can see. That's not a question, I think. You know what I'm saying? And so I think it's also about consolidating what the rest of it is. I think May is probably, I don't know the origins of why we're in May. I have to assume that it's trying to segregate us from the larger political discussions at the federal and state level. But as we know, and as we take votes up here all the time, we are as connected to those levels of government as ever before. we're products of those governments, as a matter of fact, right? The state tells us what we can and cannot do. The federal government has the Bill of Rights and all that. So I think to say that we are somehow special and different, we have to have our own election, focus just on municipal issues, is also undercutting the fact that all of these municipal issues are tied to state and federal legislation policies, and to elected officials who are elected at the state and federal level also. So we are as connected to them as ever before, and I think it's time for folks to understand that and realize that. And I think consolidating to November shows people November is the election time. And so, you know, I've also said, if you look at the data, right, so the total balance cast in Burke County, all cycle elections, sure, you can say May odd is higher than November odd, but that's because the city's also not on there. Right? And so that's the May odd, the November odd being 124,000, 10,000 or so shy, without the city being on the shows, right? If the city were to be on there, there could be an extra amount of voters on there as well. And so I do think, yes, it's a tight turnaround. Yes, the state, you know, had this provision, but we're going to make a decision. I think we have plenty of stakeholders that have weighed in, people that have been doing this work for decades. Back when there were poll taxes, right? You were involved in that back then. And so these are folks that have been on the ground for years trying to get out the votes, right? And it's not about, you know, well, there were Republicans at this time of the year, there's more Democrats at that time of the year. It's about us getting all of San Antonio to understand that November is election time. And so trying to hold it in May and say, no, it's got to be this way, this is the way it's been, we have to continue that, is not the best argument in the 21st century in this time. So that's sort of where I come from. I think everybody has some very fair points across the board, and I think that we do owe it to residents to consolidate and try our best to get as many people to vote as possible. This is a good, better, best situation. It's not the ultimate best situation for us to get out voters. Obviously, we know even November is the highest turnout, but this is a step in the right direction. So I appreciate the discussion. Thank you.
Councilman Q. Rodriguez.
Thank you. And I do want to start by apologizing to Councilwoman Gonzalez for interrupting you. You brought up because I had that reaction because several council members from the district soon we ended up reversing a march that came up and there was uproar in the district, and I can only imagine if we brought the idea of moving Fiesta, what that would do it look like. To me, it's an interrupt your district in a way. I have been thinking about this issue for a while now, and I have varying opinions on it. Especially when you might be in person on the years. And I know this is one of those times that requires us to move with a sense of urgency, but it is one that is popular and creates an opportunity that is an improvement for our democracy. With regards to taking us for a vote, the need for community engagement, and adding multiple steps along the way, we were all elected by our communities to make decisions on the minutia of city government, contracts, audits, appointments, and land use. But we were also elected to make very big decisions, sometimes under time constraints. And the reason that we do the daily work of outreach, ongoing outreach every single day, is so that in moments like this where we're under a time crunch, we already understand our residents' needs. And if we need a town hall or a survey, we can absolutely get that done quickly. I feel like some of us have done a great community engagement this far. And I'll say that in the first 7 hours after my office posted our survey, a simple one, but that primarily aims to be clear that elections would not align with presidential or gubernatorial elections, we received nearly 200 responses. see group turnout, consolidate costs, and respond to what my residents and keep asking for. And so I'm going to name a few barriers, and some of them have already been named, right? So one, Fiesta. If someone believes that if you have to choose between attending Fiesta or going to an election where you believe that your one vote does not matter, we've seen people choose to go participate in Fiesta. And when thousands of people feel that way, it has a significant impact on our elections. The second one, I represent UIW, and currently both May and June elections take place during finals and a time when my students leave town. Students do have a right to engage in elections, and you can't in one breath say that young people don't vote, but then make it more challenging to do so, or allow it to continue to be more challenging. I say we give the students the opportunity to rise to the occasion. And the three councilman mentioned, there is a psychological barrier that is ingrained in us from a very young age that elections happen in November. Moving our elections makes it more likely that people make the connection that when we talk about elections are coming up, that is the time that they've been taught that elections take place for as long as they can remember. We're going to see in a little bit a bunch of yard signs are going to start going up from January all the way through the November election. People don't see a yard sign and think out of nowhere, oh, an election's happening in May. They don't. They know an election's happening in November. So to that point, I just wanted to address a few of those barriers, right? With regard to ISDs, I think this has been the most compelling part of the conversation, right? There are some valid questions about the impact of ISDs. But I do want us to keep in mind, out of 16 or so school districts, only a few currently run elections in May. Some may choose to run, others won't, and at the end of the day, that would be okay. In the event that this is approved, I will say, in the event that this is approved, and we do move on this, we should adopt our legislative agenda, the stance that we support them, and any legislation they see with regard to their ability to move election dates, should they need to. Even if after, they receive all the information, some of the ISDs choose to keep their elections in May, we're still relieving hundreds of thousands of voters from voter fatigue, because we do have 763 school districts in our city. For whatever reason, I have 5 school districts, 2 of which are not aligned with our election, 1 of which doesn't have a school board, and only 2 of which have elections on meetings. Most ISDs have elections not aligned with ours, and they're being asked to come, those voters are being asked to come out and pay for this. So if we move, that eliminates the need for those hundreds of thousands of people to vote in May. I've reached out to a couple of my counterparts on school boards in my district to receive indications that at least one likely won't move, and this isn't something they feel particularly strong about whether we do it or not. I've also received information from SAISD that they're going to be discussing this on Monday at their board meeting to get some of their questions answered. And I will say that because we moved council elections to 4-year terms, and I said a couple times, most ISDs are going to have to confront this question during our off-year requirements. And this is an opportunity for them to address that need in a way that they didn't anticipate or have an opportunity to do so. They could also do their election in 2029 and see what turnout looks like and make a decision based on the impact, based on that impact of whether they want to move or not in 2030. We remove that opportunity if we don't move, at least for those that are not aligned with us, or that don't have another city that's going to move. I do look forward to the meeting with the superintendents and board presidents, and I agree with you in understanding total impacts and non-intentional, and what will ultimately be best for each of their positions, including ourselves. So I want to say thank you to Councilman Core for arranging the meetings. And one of the ways that I describe Councilman Core's problem-solving approach is definitely as a convener, and I love that about her. With regard to us being in office for another 6 months, I'll just say this. If council is going to continue to be the way that it has been for the past few months, I am not interested in that at all. So for me, this decision has nothing to do with us, whether or not board Democrats or Republicans show up in here. My constituents have been asking for fewer elections, and many organizations and leaders I respect who do this work are supportive of my bill. All that being said, I'll likely support this on next week unless my constituency changes their minds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to end with 2 quick points. Those are my thoughts currently. One thing that I just keep getting stuck into, and I was getting there and maybe pivoted to a different direction, as my brain does sometimes. One of the things that I think is important when we're talking about representation it's an odd election that we start the election that we see it the most. May, November 11th. And that's what really frustrates me about this entire conversation. And it's not to anyone specific, but overall, right? That it feels like conflation of what November is, and yet when I have repeatedly, year after year, in constitutional elections, I'm one of the few young people voting that in our entire city and state. And when I asked my peers to go, it's not that it's November, it's that it's with everything else. And while there's a drop off, I understand that. The drop off in my own election, I was decided 28 votes, a significant amount. And it's interesting, right? Why we always ask why do people vote, so why do they not vote? And I think for this particular point, right, we talk about young people coming out, like working class people coming out to vote, we talk about communities of color coming out to vote, particularly in our city. It's in terms of just revenue, talking about this issue, it frustrates me when it's very clear, in terms of the data, that moving this election to November may have a somewhat increase of folks who are already voting, maybe some folks who are around them, but not necessarily at large. And that's what frustrates me. Again, I'm still in this mode of, I think it's the right thing, but there's some precedent that just don't feel to be the most truthful, or at least the most impactful, in some ways, the most impactful. So I'll leave that point there with that, because I think that's just a pretty great point. I do want to ask, I know Dr. Craft and Dr. Johnson have been here almost all day. I know Dr. Craft is good education community as well. If you want to come up and share any kind of insight you have specifically, I know you've interviewed a lot of perspectives, but being the largest school district in our community, I wanted to make sure that you have a moment to speak on that. And of course, your diverse array of districts here that you also overlap with. What are some of the impacts you see from this? What are some of the logistical challenges or opportunities that you see if this were to move or not move?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Councilman DeLong, Mayor Jones, City Manager Walsh. Thank you for this discourse. It's not every day we have the opportunity to engage in such an interesting policy discussion. Currently, as Julie has articulated, I'll provide some context real quickly. We are odd year May elections, so we're looking at 27 and 29. That being said, the greatest impact that we're obviously concerned with are the potential financial implications. Now, I can't speak for the board. Dr. Ron, the president, so we've engaged in these conversations just here in the last several days. If we were to maintain a May odd election cycle, we would obviously incur additional costs. To Julia's previous point, it's really difficult, and to Walsh's point, it's really difficult to project exactly what those additional costs would be, but we would incur additional costs. A lot of it would be contingent upon the logistics of polling sites, hours. There are other things that have to be taken into consideration. I always look at things through the lens of, especially still operating a budgetary deficit, a $100 million deficit budget last year, a $32 million deficit budget this year, as allocations. 90% of our operating budget is in personnel. And I particularly look at it in the sense of how many teaching units, how many teaching allocations are we talking about. So just do some quick math. It's a $220,000 or $250,000 election cost rather than what we're typically accustomed to, which ranges between $90,000 and $120,000. Let's 3 to 4 teaching units. And so that's our primary concern. One other concern, and it's not, again, it's a logistical concern, as it was mentioned, I believe, by John, we would have to work through board policy, we would have to work through holdover doctrine, we would have to work through the restaggering of terms, which can all be done. But one of the things that we would also have to work on is kind of the onboarding, particularly of the new trustees. If a new trustee is elected, particularly in November, think about budgeting, think about personnel. We're very cyclical in this and how we operate. Hiring season is May, budgeting. We're a fiscal year end date of August 31st. What a May election does is, particularly for new trustees, they're able to be onboarded. And one of the first actions, which is incredibly important, maybe the most important, is signing off on the approval of and school taxes. And so a new board or a new trustee that is onboarded, that's one of the very first actions that they can actually put their thumbprint on. If you kind of think about the budgeting process, if we don't change into a July fiscal year, which I don't anticipate we would, because there are also implications associated with that change, they really don't have the opportunity to put their thumbprint on that budget. If you kind of think about the onboarding process, following a November election, that budget is set. In fact, we're 2 months into the fiscal year. So it's an entire new budget cycle before they have the opportunity to really go about the request and allocating dollars that are going to have the greatest impact on our students and student achievement. So that's just another nuance that in conversations and through that hasn't been mentioned.
Do you want to add that a lot of the folks in the room here raised me, and I learned from them on how to walk, how to run the office, and how to increase voter turnout. So ideally, in a perfect world, I'm with you. I want more folks at the polls and voting for us, right? But for us, and my responsibility as a school board is first to my constituents, and so the expense starting oddly in the middle of an academic year would provide a lot of logistical problems for us. But also, when I asked folks, how do you feel about this, they asked, well, we barely vote now because we don't know who's on the ballot. We don't know what the issues are. So there will be a lot more for us to do, which could be done should we decide to move to the municipal race, right? But that, just think about the voters. Like, how, we can't right now influence their vote. How are we going to get them to do it in a larger group? I get that. We all work towards that. Ideally, in a perfect world, I'm with you. But right now, my responsibility to the school district is cost. I'd rather have an additional teacher or two and not lose that ability to do that rather than invest that in changing our needs. So that's just one of the closing arguments that we have and we don't have any to. Any other questions?
That's my time. Thank you.
Councilwoman Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mayor. I was gonna ask Dr. Crafton that question as well, but it was stated earlier, I don't know why ISDs wouldn't move to November, and so I think you answered that, but essentially it's the cost, right? And not just the cost, it's more governance of the board and your budget and all of the implications of that. So I won't ask you the question again, but if there's anything you would like to add, please do.
Yeah, absolutely, Councilman Gonzalez. Thank you. And thank you also for your partnership. I had the opportunity to attain a lot of knowledge this morning, particularly with pre-K education, with our Educational Opportunities Committee. So thank you for your work and your continued partnership. You know, again, the biggest driver for us will be the associated cost, particularly in these very, very tight budgetary times. But again, there would be a year of transition that we would have to work through quite a few different logistics, which can be done. We're accustomed to change, but it would be a lift. It would be a pretty significant lift. And like I say, we want to continue to be great partners as we already are. And I appreciate the opportunity to engage in this very important topic and conversation. I'm not a political scientist, and I've learned a lot just here in the last couple of hours. But I am familiar with elections, whether it be a board election, whether it be a bond election. I will argue that whether in May or November, there are two really factors that I believe, as I've seen, that get people to the polls. And voter turnout is incredibly important. But it's voter education. Individuals have to be educated on the topics they're going to be on the ballot, whether it be a candidate, whether it be a facility matter. The other piece, though, is equally important is motivation. Are they motivated? What motivates the voters to get to the polls? As already mentioned, we work very diligently to register our seniors, for those that are 18 age, and they do increase, that number increases by the spring leading into the May election versus the November election. But ensuring that our voters are educated about matters, and then, like I say, what is the motivation that will get them actually to the polls to cast a vote? My 2 cents.
Thank you. All right, being a superintendent in Texas is kind of like a scientist. I had a question. This recent election, November 2025, and I was able to get this from our elections administrator, cost us $4 million. So that would be the cycle that we would be moving into. So let's say we moved there this month. And so those ISDs and those smaller municipalities took 1.17 million of that total $4 million cost. And the county paid the rest, the 2.7 million, because of those constitutional amendments. So I would argue that potentially is going to save their county dollars if we move there without anyone else, because it helps them share that cost versus the cost savings that we talk about, the 800 to $1 million. But it is very clear that the county taking on this $2.7 million amount, we would jump in to help the county with that, not necessarily cost savings on our side. So I just want to make that point. Again, I don't think this was a mandate by our state legislature, and I don't think we should put any unintentional mandates on this community. So thank you so much.
Councilwoman Vietnam?
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking to have this on the agenda on the 18th and further this conversation. Eric, what I do want to make sure that's on there is we have moved our election to every 4 years. So our next election is 2029. So while I appreciate the conversation we're having about school districts and their odd years, we are not running every 2 years on the odd years. So there are going to be a cost increase to them. So please include that in whatever material you have. The other is, I think we've stated in more on one effect, is that we do not think that this is a terrible idea. So I think we need to prepare, because if this doesn't move forward on the 18th, I think you are going to see council colleagues have that conversation and we take this to a charter meeting and we move it to November, because we think November is a better idea, because there are big races that happen on odd years in November that make the national news cycle, that will remind people in San Antonio, hey, I've got to go vote. So I think we need to have those conversations here. I understand the wanting the more time. I understand wanting to get more engagement. I understand, do we take it to the voters, do we not take it to the voters? What we have here presented in front of us is an opportunity. And if you've been doing this for as long as I have, and I've been doing this for a long time, and I am a political science major, is that I know my community, and I know the public. And right now, we're putting out a survey, and it's yes, no, it doesn't matter. And that's where we're at. If we decide on the 18th we want to take this further, then we'll take it further, but we need to have this conversation. This makes sense. I don't care if it's $50,000 we save, because that's $50,000 I can use to fill pockets or program something for Metro Health. So it may not be the cost savings that were spit out there, but it's going to be some cost savings, because we are splitting the election with others. And my plan is to bring my districts, Harlandale, Southside, East Central, SAISD, try to bring them along and talk to my state representatives, because I believe the state has the money to help me move these elections to odd number years. But those are larger conversations we're having. And right now the conversation is, we communicated our efforts, now let's get some input via email from our voters, and then on the 18th we decide, and then we move forward from there. But I appreciate the conversation and the efforts, but I think we made this a lot longer than we needed to. Thank you.
To make it longer, no, I was going to make that point. I'm sorry, Dr. Pat. You said your next election is when you win?
Yes, sir. We're on May, so May 27th and May 29th.
Or you guys staggered?
That's staggered, sir.
Okay, yeah, so
For board elections.
Gotcha. So the bullet points that my two colleagues made, this next election year, obviously will not be on that ballot, even if we decide not to move the election.
That's correct. So this May, we will not have an election. Next May, May 27th, we'll be with the municipalities that we host the elections in.
Right.
As soon as we make the transition.
Right. The city of San Antonio will be there, right? Our next one will be later on, so that's going to have to be a little different already for you.
We'll see some increased costs as a result.
Right.
That's probably a question.
Yes, regardless of what we do next week.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and that's why our election costs, they vary. We look at 23, we look at 25, we can see that it varies again depending on registered voters. And as already articulated, the county election officer drives and dictates our cost share portion.
Yeah, and you made a good point about elected officials coming in and budget process very similar here. Do all the other school districts have the same fiscal year timeline?
Most are August 31st, but districts do have the opportunity to move the fiscal year back to July. The challenge in doing so is once you, if you kind of think about the incurrence of operational costs. So for the first year that you do, or you make that transition, you're saving electricity, et cetera. But once you move from August, you back it up to July, you're really stuck because if you go back to the opposite, or to the other end of the spectrum, you're now incurring those costs times two in essence.
Absolutely. And my point is being that some school districts that have no elections have the same fiscal year as you all.
Most are on August 31st. I can't speak to all districts in Bear County, but the July one is another option.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford. Absolutely. Thank you. And then the other thing too is that if we're interested in helping the other government entities save money for election, we can still keep our bond elections in May. Is that correct, sir?
Councilman, I'm sorry, we were just talking about the schedule. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my point was that if we were interested in putting elections on to help other government entities save money, we could keep municipal bond elections in May years.
Right, but those happen pretty infrequently.
Right.
Right now.
Exactly. I'm just saying if we have propositions that we on the city do, we can put those in May, even if we change to November.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That's all.
Councilman Rodriguez. I want to address a couple of points. The charter review that was done in Dallas, the reason they had to do that, they had to do it stuff in their charter because their charter required their election to be in May. So that's why they had to do that, just to lay that flat. I really also want to make sure that we are, we caution against the assumption that the election can just bring this up again, right? That is a critical assumption, and as was just mentioned, this is an opportunity that we may or may not get again, but we understand that there is a savings. We might not know the exact amount, and it's been laid out. There will be an increase in turnout, as the data also clearly lays out. Moving Fiesta, which seems novel. Moving Fiesta doesn't necessarily mean people would now associate May with voting, right? So I can understand the logistical, I mean, that's something, you get larger logistical lift than doing this, but just because you move Fiesta doesn't mean that people don't more associate voting with that month. On the cost savings, let me reiterate, while we don't know the exact amount, and I certainly appreciate, again, I put the city manager on the spot and gave me an answer of $800K to $1 million, and we don't know exactly what the savings would be. We know there would be a savings. We know that for certain. And as we face fiscal challenges, we owe it to ourselves to not only, again, benefit from that savings, as Councilwoman Vietnam mentioned, because even if we only got half of what Dallas got, Dallas estimated a savings of $432,000. Even if we only got half of that, that's $215K-ish, right? I mean, you know, if we got that, Councilman White, this is how we pay for more cops, right? I mean, there's much better ways to use these resources and have the benefit of hearing from more of our folks.
Will you support more cops?
Well, we gotta have the money. I mean, there's the idea, and you gotta pay for it, right? So this is where we have to be fiscally responsible, understanding there are benefits to be had. When it comes to the on this idea of, well, we gotta move it to the evening years, and we know that is, the ideal, for some. While there is, again, yes, undeniable highest turnout is in November, when people are associating it, and in on years, the legislation doesn't allow for that. So we have to, I think, again, deal with the opportunity that we have, imperfect as it may be. But I think this does, for others, preserve what we also find to be important in these races, is that they are nonpartisan. Right? And this legislation, with that, not only the time frame, but also, again, making this only apply to municipalities that have an odd year election, it ensures that. There is nothing to say that we cannot still move these to November, and then, to your point, work with the state delegation to work toward that. That to me seems highly implausible, however, given the state legislation, and frankly some of our state leaders are looking at redistricting right now in a way that dilutes the voice of the exact voters that this change would help. Okay. To the ISDs, I'm a proud product of Northside, right? Proud product, and I understand this is not a decision to be made lightly. 1 in 10 kids in the country calls our state home, understood. 4th largest school district in the state, understood. I come back to the fact, though, that if we are all concerned and committed to what I think is our mutual business of raising an educated citizenry that participates, that we reduce barriers to doing that. I think there are cost savings. There are cost savings through the school districts of also moving to November. There are also benefits, intangible, but benefits of hearing from more voters in November. I understand the logistical considerations that the superintendent raised, which have obviously been addressed by those other school districts that already have their elections in November. So not an impossible task. I understand the lift. But if we are as committed to an educated voting citizenry, then we have a responsibility to do that. Because as you point out, those if you stayed in May, right, those costs would increase, but that is optional. That's a choice that your school district would be making. And is one that, again, we balance hearing from more municipal voters, right? What is the greatest public good? We balance that with, again, the opportunities that you also have, and frankly, the more time you have to make this. We have just a couple of weeks to make the decision to save money and hear from more voters, and you have much more time to address that. Thank you again to everybody that took the time to share your expertise and help us have a really robust conversation here. As we are, frankly, this is not just about what is happening here. I think we're all also cognizant of what is happening in general on the voting landscape and our responsibility to ensure, at least here in San Antonio, that we are doing everything we can do possible to reduce the barriers to voting for our constituents. Okay. Thank you again to everybody. I ask my colleagues to remain seated while I take us into that session. The time is now 4:34 p.m. on December 10th, 2025. City Council of the City of San Antonio now is in executive session to consult with the Attorney's Office pursuant to Chapter 551 of the General Code and to discuss the following items: economic development negotiations pursuant to Section 551.007 for the purchase, exchange, lease, or value of real property pursuant to Section 551.072, and legal issues related to litigation involving the city with residents and fairness and collective bargaining law pursuant to Section 551.6.
Test, test. Test, test, test.
No, I'll go ask her if we can grab her before when they come out of class. Yeah, and him do all of that. Yeah. Someone's got to. How long have you been there? I've been at 4 since probably about 5 months, but it hasn't been a crazy long time. How about you? What station? Oh, okay, I got you.
I just asked. She said talk with her after exec. They're going in. So.
After exec over there?
Yeah.
So we'll probably.
Yeah, we'll be hanging around here. They're in the back room.
Okay.
They gotta come back out for public comment.
Okay.
So we'll just go.
Señora Patricia, cuéntame qué le parece que cambien las fechas de inscripción en mayo a noviembre. ¿Parece que aumentaría la participación?
Claro que sí, y pienso que tenemos la obligación de cambiar lo que podamos para incrementar la participación de los votantes. Y esta es una muy buena oportunidad y hay que tomar a ventaja, porque no sabemos cuándo vamos a tener esta oportunidad.
Claro, y aparte también las elecciones no coinciden con el festival técnico.
So from a reporter standpoint, television is good.
Es un problema
But,
por muchas razones, pero en términos de votación es un problema enorme, porque la gente no está pensando en votar, y eso hace daño a la comunidad, especialmente cuando estamos tomando decisiones en línea.
Un placer.
It's off. Just turn it on. Mayor, this timeline seems really, really rushed. I mean, how are you feeling about it?
I mean, look, this is what we've got. This is the hand we've been dealt, right? This deadline is based on the state laws that changed, and they dictate we've got to, if we want to do this, we got to do it by the December 31st, 2025. Look, very thankful that community leaders have spoken in, have weighed in on this, right? 5 former mayors, lots of community groups, voting rights groups. So I really hope that we don't let process get in the way of progress, right? This is what we need to be focused on. We need to make it easier for folks to vote. And moving the election from May to November does that. It saves us money. City manager couldn't exactly quantify it, but it saves us money, right? And the data is very clear. you've got many more forces helping to turn out folks in a November election, even if it's an odd year, in a November election, because people associate voting with November. So this is something I think that we need to do for the people of San Antonio.
On the questions of savings, looking at the slide that the city staff put out, it does appear that when the city did a November election, the charter election, it was still more expensive than the May elections have been. So where's that calculation of savings coming from?
Yeah, I think again, as the city manager said, his initial estimate is that this would save the city $800,000 to $1 million. So the exact savings, as he said, is going to be based on how many others are on the ballot. So we'll leave that to the elections folks and for the city manager to give you the exact savings. But Dallas, let's be very clear, Dallas, they estimated their savings would be $432,000. And so even if we only get half of that, again, we've got a budget gap, right? And we have other things, higher priority things that we should be investing in. So we save money and we hear from more voters. This is a win-win.
And the city will be taking the decision next week?
We're voting on this on December 18th. So if folks, if you haven't already, reached out to your council person, make sure that they know where you are on this issue. We should not assume that we will have this opportunity again. Right? There is nothing that guarantees that. This is the opportunity before us. The case is very clear. Dallas, November. Austin, November. Houston, November. Voto Latino, League of Women Voters San Antonio, COPS Metro, right? I mean, people that do this work day in and day out are very clear about the benefits to San Antonio of doing this.
The majority of the council members seem to be reluctant at this point to move forward with a change. How confident are you that a majority of them will come to your side by next week?
We'll keep working it.
So compared to November of even yeared elections, I mean, this state seems to have made it clear that this is only for November of odd years elections. Is that really a benefit in trying to get voter turnout when even year elections just get substantially more turnout than constitutional?
Comparing it to an even year frankly, it's a non sequitur at this point, right? That is not the opportunity before us. Yes, we know that the highest voter turnout is in November of an even year. We know that, but that is not the opportunity we have. Right? The opportunity we have is only to move it to November of the odd year, which we already saw, as you saw on the slide, has itself benefits to do that, substantial benefits, right? Because in May, while our turnout is relatively high and not relatively high, it could be better, frankly, when you're still not hearing from 85% of folks. In May, as you heard here, you have voting rights groups and voter engagement groups that just aren't working at that time because their focus is on November or on the primary. So by moving it to November, we save money as a city. We also have the benefit of higher turnout, but all those groups, especially the groups that were here today, Radical Registrars, League of Women Voters San Antonio, all these groups that are focused on voter engagement, they now have the ability to consolidate all of that, frankly, firepower, if you will, and then drive up turnout even more. So there is, again, that make sure you capture that slide in that, as the professor said, very likely, just based on our voting patterns already, that we could actually see a higher turnout than Houston. This is all based on the very simple premise, the more voters, the more neighbors that we hear from, the better our democracy works. Right, and our government works. Okay, thank y'all. Appreciate it.
Lastly,
thank you.
The legislature would, if this goes through, the only other way the city would be able to change it is with legislative approval. Do you feel
look, in a state that has just redistricted, right, to have, to favor a certain kind of voter, more certain kinds of voters, there is no guarantee about what happens in the future. This is the opportunity we have. I would argue we should take this. We don't know if it's going to, if or when it's going to come again. All right. Thank y'all.
Cool. Thanks, Sharon. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Once you throw it in, you can't DP that back. right around open corporate